They said it. The bags was sitting in the middle of the parking garage, right next to the elevator on level 2. Like someone had set it down to check their phone, and simply never came back. Thomas Reed almost walked past it. He'd been working since 5:30 that morning. A burst pipe on the 14th floor of the Halcyon Grand had flooded 2 rooms and taken out half the plumbing on the east wing. Dicky. By the time he finished, his jeans were soaked through, his boots smelled like standing water, and the only thing his mind could hold on to was the image of his daughter, Mara, asleep in her hospital bed, 18 blocks away, her small hand wrapped around the corner of a blanket she'd had since she was 3. Desai, he stopped. The bag was a black, leather duffel, expensive looking. The kind with brass zipper pulls and reinforced seams. No luggage tag. No one nearby. The garage was quiet, except for the hum of the ventilation system and the distant ping of an elevator somewhere above him. Thomas stood there for a long moment. He was 38 years old. He'd spent the last 11 years doing everything right, showing up on time, paying every bill he could, raising Mara alone after her mother left when Mara was 4. He'd been a good father. He'd been an honest man. And right now, honest men were not exactly being rewarded by the universe. This hospital had called 3 times that week about the balance on Mara's account. The pediatric specialist. The pediatricus, the one who actually understood what was happening in her lungs, was out of network. The number they'd quoted him was so large it didn't feel real, the way certain fears are too enormous to fully land. He crouched down and unzipped the bag. Stacks of bills, banded and orderly, filled the interior from one end to the other. Thomas didn't count it. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough cash in his life to know that what he was looking at was more money than he would earn in 5 years. Maybe 10. He zipped it back up. Destin. He stood there in the half-dark of the parking garage, alone, and breathed. The Halcyon Grand was the kind of hotel that didn't post its room rates on its website. The lobby had flowers that probably cost more per arrangement than Thomas made in a week, and the staff moved through it with the particular smoothness of people trained to be invisible in plain sight. Thomas had been doing maintenance work in the building for 4 years. He knew the service entrances, the freight elevator schedules, the names of the housekeeping supervisors. He said it, he knew where to go. He took the bag to the front desk. The woman at the counter, young, dark-haired, a name tag that said Francesca, looked at him the way people sometimes looked at Thomas when he came in through the wrong door. A long, half-second assessment. The work clothes, the faint smell of pipe water, the duffel bag held in hands that were still dirty at the knuckles. "I found this in the parking garage," Thomas said. "Level 2, by the north elevator. I think someone left it." Francesca's expression shifted. "Did you? Is there anything?" "There's cash inside," he said. "A lot of it. I didn't count it, and I didn't take anything. I just want to make sure it gets back to whoever lost it." She stared at him. "Do you need me to write down my name?" he asked. "I can write down my name." What Thomas didn't know, because he had no reason to know it, was that a woman named Cecilia Vance was watching this exchange from across the lobby. Cecilia was 51 years old, and the founder of Vance Capital, a private equity firm whose name appeared on buildings in 4 states. She was at the Halcyon Grand for a board meeting that had ended an hour early, which was the only reason she was in the lobby at all. Either lobby at all, rather than already in the car that was supposed to take her to the airport. She was standing near a column, phone in hand, not looking at her phone. She was looking at the man at the front desk. He had a particular quality, Cecilia. The ability to read a room with the same precision she applied to financial statements. She'd built her entire career on seeing things other people didn't notice. The detail buried in the footnotes. The detail buried in the footnotes. The hesitation before a handshake. The moment when someone's confidence was performance rather than bedrock. It was not a comfortable way to move through the world, but it had made her very successful. What she saw now was a man in soiled work clothes, placing a bag full of money on a marble counter and asking for nothing in return. She didn't go to her car. The hotel's head of security, a man named Burrell, who Thomas had played cards with twice at the staff Christmas party, came down to take the bag and Thomas's information. Burrell counted the cash in the back office, while Thomas waited in a chair in the corridor. The number came to $63,000. Thomas signed a form. He gave his phone number. He walked back through the lobby toward the service entrance. To sit down, he didn't see Cecilia watching him go. He didn't see her speak quietly to the young woman at the concierge desk. Ask one question and receive the answer that told her approximately which maintenance company handled the hotel's plumbing contracts. Doubts. Thomas was already thinking about Mara. This sound. The next morning was a Tuesday. Thomas dropped Mara's favorite breakfast, a blueberry muffin from the place on Clement Street that she loved since she was old enough to have opinions about muffins. At the hospital, on his way to his first job, she was awake. She was awake, which was a good sign. She was 7 years old and she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's way of looking directly at you when she spoke, like she was checking to make sure you were actually there. "You smell like work already," she said. "Good morning to you too. Did you sleep? Did you sleep?" Some. She considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. "You should sleep more, Dad." "Bennett, I know. I had a dream about a dog. We've talked about the dog. In the dream we had it already." She said this with the kind of calm finality that meant she knew she wasn't winning, but was lodging the preference for the record. Then she looked at her muffin, and her expression changed into something warmer. "You got the right one." Thomas stayed for 20 minutes. Then he had a job across town, and he had to go. In the elevator, on the way down, he pressed the button for the ground floor and stood very still and did not let himself think about the number the specialist had quoted, or about the letter from his landlord, or about the fact that had exactly 1 month before things became truly unmanageable. He had learned, over the years, that thinking about those things while he was trying to function served no useful purpose. He filed them in the part of his mind he designated for later. And he went to work. The call came on Thursday. It wasn't from the hotel. It was from his supervisor at Hargrove Mechanical, the company that held the Halcyon contract. His supervisor's name was Perkins, and Perkins was not a man who called to congratulate people. "There's been a complaint," Perkins said. From the hotel. Thomas was in his truck, parked outside a job site in the Richmond district. "What kind of complaint?" "They're saying you accessed a restricted area, that you were seen on camera in a service corridor." you weren't supposed to be in. I've been in that corridor 100 times. They're also saying. Perkins paused, and in the pause, Thomas felt something shift. They're saying there was a discrepancy with a lost item that was brought to the front desk. The air in the truck went very still. I brought that item to the front desk, Thomas said. I found it in the garage, and I turned it in. I believe you, Perkins said, in the voice of a man who was about to say something that contradicted the previous sentence. But the hotel is saying the cash was short when they counted it against their camera footage. Thomas, I've got to be straight with you. I can't protect the contract if I didn't take anything. Set it down. I know that's what you're saying. That's what happened. Ass. Thomas. Another pause. I have to let you go. I'm sorry. If it gets cleared up, it won't get cleared up. That's not how this goes. Asses. He hung up the phone. He sat in the truck for a long time. Outside, a family was walking a dog down the sidewalk, a golden retriever, that kept trying to stop and smell everything. And the father of the family was laughing at it, holding the leash and shaking his head like this was the best problem he could imagine having. Thomas watched them until they turned the corner. He didn't tell Mara. She had enough to carry. He picked up 2-day jobs that week through a labor app, the kind of work that didn't require a reference from a previous employer. It paid less. He took it in the evenings. He sat in the apartment that was already half-packed because he'd been quietly preparing for the possibility of having to move, and he worked out scenarios on a legal pad. Numbers, options. The arithmetic of a life being compressed. Professor. The story about the money reached him a week later, not through any official channel, but through a guy named Pete, who worked for a different maintenance company and had heard it from someone at the hotel that the guy who'd returned the cash had skimmed off the top, that he'd been fired, that the hotel was considering pressing charges. Pete told him in the parking lot of a supply store with the slightly pained look of someone delivering information they're not sure the other person wants. That's not what happened, Thomas said. Yeah, Pete said. I figured. He said to set it down. But figuring wasn't the same as being able to do anything about it. Cecilia Vance had not forgotten about the man at the front desk. She'd asked a few questions. She'd found out Thomas's name from the concierge who'd spoken to Burrell, who had not been particularly careful about discretion. She knew which company he worked for on the morning of the second Thursday, when a piece of information found its way to her that she had not been looking for. That the man who had returned $63,000 to the Halcyon Grand had been fired for allegedly stealing from it. She set down her coffee and sat with that for a very long time. Cecilia had grown up in a small city in central Ohio. Her father had worked for 30 years in a machine shop and had been let go at 58 when the shop closed. 2 years before, he would have been vested in his pension. The company had done this legally. It was not illegal to do this. Her father had understood that, and it had not made it less devastating. Cecilia had watched him absorb that blow with a quietness that she'd mistaken for acceptance when she was young, and that she now understood, with more years behind her, was something closer to a man deciding not to break in front of his family. She picked up her phone. She did not call Thomas. She wasn't ready to do that yet, and she wasn't ready to do that and she thought it would frighten him, which was not the effect she wanted. Instead, she called a woman named Frances, who was an investigator she'd used twice before for due diligence on acquisitions. She asked Frances to find out everything she could about the lost bag, the hotel's security footage, and the specific claim that the returned cash had been short. "How fast?" Frances asked. "Fast," Cecilia said. What Frances found in 5 days was this. The security footage from the parking garage showed Thomas discovering the bag, opening it briefly, zipping it closed, and carrying it directly to the elevator. The footage from the lobby showed him placing it on the counter. There was a gap of 22 minutes between the bag being received by the hotel and it being officially counted, during which time it had sat in a back office while Burrell waited for his supervisor to come down. The gap had not been adequately explained. The shortfall in the count, $4,000, was consistent with the bag having been accessed during that window. They said the hotel had not looked very hard at this possibility. It was easier to look at Thomas. Frances delivered her findings in a document that was 11 pages long. Cecilia read it twice. Then she called the managing director of the Halcyon Grand, a man named Ashworth, who had been trying to get a meeting with her for 2 years about a development project in which he believed Vance Capital might be interested. The conversation was brief. Cecilia had not achieved what she had achieved by being ungentle, when gentleness was the wrong tool.
Eva.
"You fired a man for stealing money that I think your own staff may have walked off with," she said. "And I think you know that's what happened. So, here's what I'd like to discuss." The call Thomas wasn't expecting came on a Wednesday morning while he was eating cereal standing at his kitchen counter, because he'd packed the chairs and hadn't gotten around to unpacking them. An unknown number. He almost let it go. "Is this Thomas Reed?" A woman's voice, calm, precise. Not the voice of someone making a routine call. "Depends on who's asking. My name is Cecilia Vance. I was at the Halcyon Grand the afternoon you returned that bag." He set down his bowl. "Okay. I saw what you did. And then I started paying attention to what happened afterward, and I want to tell you that I believe you, and that I've been working on correcting it." A pause. "I'd like to meet with you if you're willing. Not because I want anything from you. Because I think something was done to you that shouldn't have been, and I'd like to tell you to your face where things stand." Thomas was quiet for long enough that she said, "Mr. Reed?" "Why?" he said. "People don't just. Why?" "Because I watched you do something that cost you a great deal," she said. "And I've been thinking about it ever since." They met at a coffee shop in the Sunset District, which Thomas had suggested because it was his neighborhood, and he felt less wrong-footed on his own ground. Cecilia arrived 5 minutes early and was already seated when he came in. A woman in a gray coat who looked like money, but not in a way that required you to announce it. She told him what Frances had found. She told him about the conversation with Ashworth. She told him that Hargrove Mechanical had been notified that the complaint against Thomas was being formally withdrawn, and that the hotel had agreed to provide a written statement clearing his name. Thomas listened to all of this. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a moment. "The 4,000, he said finally. "Did they find who took it?" "Burrell resigned," Cecilia said. "Make of that what you will." Thomas looked at his coffee. He was not a man who cried easily, or at all, really. He'd learned that composure was a tool, and he'd used it for years. But there was something happening in his chest that he had to sit with very carefully before he could speak. Why does it still feel like? He stopped, started again. I did the right thing. I know I did. But these last few weeks, it's felt like doing the right thing was a mistake, Cecilia said.
Yes.
Yeah, I know that feeling. She said it simply, without embellishment, and he believed her. It's not. It wasn't. But I understand why it doesn't feel that way right now. He told her about Mara that afternoon. Not because he planned to, but because she asked how he was doing, and he was tired of compressing the truth into something manageable. He told her about the specialist, and the number, and the insurance gap, and the legal pad full of scenarios, none of which had a satisfying conclusion. He told her about the blueberry muffins from Clement Street, and about Mara's dream about the dog, and about how Mara looked at him. Sometimes, like she was the one doing the worrying. He set it down, which was not how it was supposed to go. Cecilia listened. She did not offer solutions while he was talking. This was a quality Thomas noticed and respected, because most people could not do it. When he finished, she said, "Can I ask you something? And I need you to understand this isn't charity, because I'm very serious about that distinction." Okay, I have a foundation. It funds pediatric care for families in exactly the situation you're describing. Referrals go through a committee, but I sit on that committee and the specialist you're talking about. I'd like to make a call. She looked at him steadily. This is not because you returned the money. It's not a transaction. I want to be clear about that. Then why? Because Mara deserves good care, she said, and because you do too. Both of those things are just true. The specialist's name was Dr. Anand Mehta, and he had kind eyes and the brisk efficiency of someone who had learned to communicate clearly, because the alternative was confusion at the worst possible moments. He reviewed Mara's file in 3 days and called Thomas directly to discuss a treatment course that had shown meaningful results in cases like hers. Thomas sat on the edge of his bed and listened and took notes on the same legal pad he'd used for the financial scenarios. And the list on this page looked completely different from the ones before it. He visited Mara that evening, and she knew. Something had shifted because she had always been able to read him, even at 7. "Dad," she said, "what happened?" "Something good," he said. She studied him. "For real good?" "For real good." She considered this carefully. The way she did with information that seemed too large to accept, all at once. Then she settled back against her pillow and looked at the ceiling with an expression of cautious relief that was so much older than her face. "Okay," she said finally. "Good." They stayed like that for a while, not talking. The evening light going soft through the hospital window. The sounds of the floor going on around them. The carts in the hallway. The distant beeping of monitors. The ordinary noise of a place where people fought quietly every day to keep things intact. After a while, Mara picked up her colored pencils and started drawing on the back of a flyer someone had left on her tray. Table. Thomas watched her work. "What is it?" he asked. She turned it around. 2 figures, roughly drawn in the way of a 7-year-old, who is not yet trying to be precise. A tall one and a small one, standing next to something that might have been a tree or might have been a building. Underneath, in her careful, blocky printing, she had written 2 words: us, together. Thomas looked at it for a long time. "Can I keep this?" he said. "I made it for you," she said. As though this should have been obvious. He and Cecilia didn't arrive at anything quickly or neatly. That was not how either of them worked. They had coffee twice more, and then dinner once at a place Thomas chose, because it was good and unpretentious, and he wasn't going to perform being someone he wasn't. And Cecilia seemed to understand and appreciate that about the selection. They talked about a great many things that had nothing to do with bags full of money or foundation committees. They disagreed about a few of them. This serious them, which Thomas took as a good sign. What he noticed over those weeks was that Cecilia Vance, who could have been any number of things given what she'd built and what it had cost her, had chosen somewhere along the way to stay curious about people, to actually look, to not assume that what was on the surface of a thing was all there was to it. It was, he thought, a rare quality. He'd tried to practice it himself, imperfectly, for most of his adult life. He mentioned this to her once, and she said, "I think you're probably better at it than you give yourself credit for." "I don't know about that." "You noticed the bag," she said. "You could have walked past it. Just then, anyone would have stopped." "They really wouldn't have," she said. "That's the thing." That Mara came home in the early part of November, 6 weeks after Dr. Mehta started her on the new protocol. The apartment was no longer half-packed. Thomas had unpacked the chairs. She walked in, slowly, still careful with her body the way she'd been taught to be for now, and looked around the apartment with the thoroughness of someone returning from a long trip and wanting to confirm that everything was still where they'd left it. "It's the same," she said. "Did you think it wouldn't be?" "I didn't know." She moved to the couch and sat down, tucking her feet under her, wrapping herself in the blanket she'd asked Thomas to bring from the hospital. She looked at him across the room. "Are we okay now?" Set it down. He crossed to the couch and sat beside her. She leaned against his arm. "Yeah," he said, "we're okay." Outside, the November light was doing something particular on the windows of the building. Across the street, the kind of late afternoon angle that turns ordinary glass into gold. Mara saw it too, because she pointed at it without saying anything. Just a small gesture of acknowledgement, the way she'd been doing since she was old enough to notice that certain things were worth pointing at. Sena Thomas put his arm around her. Some things, he'd learned, didn't resolve neatly. The hard parts didn't disappear just because better things came after them, but there was a particular quality to moments like this one. His daughter home, the room warm, the light doing that thing on the glass that made the weight of the previous months settle into something he could carry differently. Not gone, just different. He thought about the parking garage, the bag on the ground, the long moment before he picked it up. He thought about what it had cost him and what it had ultimately brought him back to. He thought, "I would do it again." And he knew, without having to think about it any further, that this was the truest thing he knew about himself. That it had always been the truest thing, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was expensive, even when no one was watching, which was when it mattered most. Mara fell asleep against his shoulder sometime around 6 o'clock. Breathing slowly and steadily, her hand loosely holding the edge of the blanket she'd had since she was 3. Thomas didn't move. He stayed there while the gold left the windows, and the room went blue and quiet. Blue, quiet, and thought about nothing in particular, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the ground beneath him was solid. I keep thinking about that moment in the parking garage. Thomas standing alone. No cameras he knew about. No one watching. A bag with $63,000 at his feet, and his daughter in a hospital, 18 blocks away, with bills he couldn't pay. Nobody would have known. That's the part that stays with me. Nobody would have known if he'd walked out with that bag, and yet he didn't. Not because someone was watching, because of who he was when no one was. I think we underestimate how much that costs. We talk about honesty like it's easy, like it's just a choice you make. But Thomas made that choice at the exact moment it was most expensive. His rent was overdue. Mara's specialist was out of network. He was one bad month away from losing everything, and he still zipped that bag back up and carried it to the front desk. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. What got me about his story wasn't just the act itself. It was what happened after. He did right, and the world punished him for it anyway. He lost his job. His name got dragged through the mud. He sat in his truck and watched a family walk a dog down the street and had to hold himself together with both hands. Most people, after that, would have told themselves they'd learned their lesson. That honesty was a luxury they couldn't afford. I think a lot of us have been in a version of that parking garage. And I think a lot of us have walked past the bag. Not because we're bad people, because we're tired, and we're scared, and the math of survival doesn't always leave room for principle. But here's what I notice about people like Thomas. They don't just have good values. They have a kind of intelligence about what actually matters. He understood, in some quiet and uncomplicated way, that the version of himself who kept that money wasn't a version he could live inside. That's not naivety. That's clarity, the ability to see past the immediate pressure to the longer shape of a life. Cecilia saw it too, which is why she couldn't stop thinking about him. He set it down. She'd spent decades reading people, and she knew what she was looking at. And then there's the part nobody talks about enough. The endurance. The weeks he spent after losing his job, working day labor, filling a legal pad with numbers, not breaking in front of Mara, not telling her how bad it was 'cause she had enough to carry. That's a particular kind of strength. The kind that doesn't announce itself. It just keeps showing up every morning and does what needs to be done. I don't think Thomas got lucky. I think Cecilia found him because he was findable. Because the kind of person who returns $63,000 in the worst month of his life is the kind of person who leaves a trail of integrity that other people can follow back to him. What you do when it costs the most is what sets the terms for everything that comes after. Mara drew 2 figures on the back of a flyer and wrote us. Together, underneath. I think about that drawing more than anything else in this story. Because that's what it was all for. Not the money, not the vindication. Just that. A dad and his daughter, on solid ground, staying together.